Please join me in welcoming Robert Haas.
I think of the joke. The first prize is a book of Robert Haas's essays. Second prize is 3 books of Robert Haas's. So I need to thank Megan and Gwen and the 2 Adams and to Kate for the ride from the airport and Jim Peters for A Morning of Birding and Cherie Peters for years of gracious care for us in the past. It was thrilling to get to work with Marilyn. And we had a just brilliant company. I'm feeling very sad, but there is a shipboard romance thing about these workshops. It makes it feel slightly mourning when I go in. And of course, Wyatt and Barbara. So I respond to prompts. Wyatt Prunty tends to khakis. Unpleated with a crisp crease in each leg. And polo shirts freshly laundered and well-pressed or fabricated from some synthetic miracle cloth that replicates that effect. And he always looks cool in the summer heat of Tennessee, even in God's anvil days in the middle of July. I mention this because the Writers' Conference at Sewanee is a complicated operation. It involves lots of scheduling, not just the lectures and the readings and the appearance of guest editors who come and go. The novelists and poets and essayists and playwrights need to be fed and they need to sleep and they like to socialize, and all this must occur inside the green given hours of a Sewanee summer day, and it couldn't look like military clockwork because this is writers we're talking about. And it does happen with an apparent casualness and in a relaxed and orderly fashion, rather like the casual dress of a man in khakis and a polo shirt, or the occasional short-sleeve plaid shirt with a button-down collar, which suggests that Wyatt is very good at delegating worry to very competent people. And for that to work in the way it works at Sewanee, they have to be people who like each other, or at least get along with each other, and getting along with each other and making things work in what anxious people call real time involves taking a broad view of human nature. And even with the best of help, things are occasionally going to go wrong, given the vagaries of the weather, lightning, thunder showers, the leisurely drip of raindrops from the leaves of the live oaks after a summer drenching. And then there is animal and human nature and the proclivities of writers when they are not at their work, the natural apprehensions of young writers who come to Sewanee with the young writers' natural apprehensions. And I have never in my several summers on the mountain seen things go very wrong or seen Wyatt respond as if they had when they had, which means, first of all, that he must out-anticipate most forms of anxiety. And it also means having some expectation that things are from time to time going to go wrong. And here 2 themes converge, because taking a broad view of human nature is another descriptor for persons endowed with a sense of humor. And it might also be thought of as a descriptor for a person who understands that things are likely to slip a cog or 2 from time to time, and who have decided to cultivate a style that took that fact and its consequences in stride, which involves regarding time as the palpable medium through which we walk and in which things happen. This may also make it desirable to get above that space from time to time. Anyway, the convergence of these 2 dispositions, taking a broad view of human nature and taking in stride what may be why Southerners are so good at telling stories. And the idiom in stride could take us to the idea of a metrical foot, which would then lead us to the mystery of the relationship between technique and temperament and the wonder of Wyatt Prunty's poems, and that's a subject for another time. Thank you, Wyatt. So I'm going to start with a recent thing called the Government Lake. It was dark out, and I could hear the cicada out the window where there's a lawn, several very large pine trees, and a pond. And it was going like crazy. Derrip, derrip, derrip-a-rip sometimes, but in no particular sequence. Mostly it was just derrip, derrip, but piercing, as in the poem by Basho that goes something like, deep stillness, the voice of the cicada drills into the rocks. I was feeling restless anyway, so I went out into the dark and lay down on the lawn. It was a little wet with night dew and the air was cold, and I found myself looking right into the eyes of a cicada that just kept at it, derrip, derrip, apparently indifferent to my presence. I said to it, trying to sound sociable without sounding needy, "Did you know the poet Jim Tate died?" And the cicada said, "Can't you see I'm trying to attract a mate? Would you please get the hell out of here?" And I said, I was a little hurt, "I thought you'd like to know." And the cicada said, you could almost hear it sighing, or the circadian equivalent of a sigh, "Was he a friend of yours or something?" And I said, more, a companion spirit than a friend. We were both poets. I admired his work. I think he liked me. And do you feel like your work, beside other cicadas, happens that you respect it sometimes? And he said, "Of course not. We compete relentlessly. What do you think I'm doing out here in the dark?" I said, "But there must be some other cicadas whose style you admire. You know, you're both out there working. You must think, hey, that dude is pretty good." The cicada said, "We never call each other dude. That's totally a human thing. And I need to get back to singing, okay? You really got to get out of here. You're in my kitchen." Well, I can go back in. I have a little book of Jim Tate's poems that was published after he died. They're prose poems. Mostly they're odd little stories. "Can you attract a mate with a prose poem?" the cicada asked. I said, "Probably not." Well, that's why I'm committed to the lyric. So anyway, I'm going to make a joke, okay? Bug off. And I said, well, let me just quote to you this one Japanese poem. It's pretty famous in the human world. It goes, "You'd never know from the cicada's cry that it was going to die." I went back to my room where all you could hear outside in the dark was derrip, derrip. But I was pretty used to it, and I picked up the book of Jim Tate's last poems. It's called The Government Lake, and I began to read it. So that's... I think I've read this here before because it's was a gift to me of Sewanee. See if I can find it. I put all these things in, and they didn't tell me where anything is. Okay, this is Okefenokee, a story. We were in a swamp on the Georgia coast near Folkestone doing a population survey, which is pretty sketchy work. A slow drawl. We're lying on a raft in the middle of flooded quarry up on the Cumberland Plateau. Late afternoon in Tennessee. One blue heron in the shallows. Old live oaks festooned with moss. My companions are telling wildlife ecologist version of war stories. "The only way you can tell a male from a female alligator," he was saying as the water lapped and rocked us, "is by digital inspection." So my buddy Dwayne, his wife had just left him, and I have seen a soberer man than he was that day, rammed his hand into the cloacal fold of the biggest goddamn gator you've ever seen. We had her pinned and tied pretty good, but she's thrashing seriously. We're all sweating seriously, and the odor is not inconsiderable. And Dwayne is up to his forearm yelling, hold her, just a minute, it's a male." And he pulls his hand out and his wedding ring is gone. And he just stares at his hand a minute, and we just sit there staring at him because we held that gator about as long as we were inclined to do. So, of course, we knew the decision was up to him. So that's that. To listen to all of you guys here, I finally got to use a Southern accent in a piece of writing. Okay, this is called Pertinent Divagations Toward an Ode to Inuit Carvers. And I wanted to tell my young friends here that this poem mentions the names of 3 Latin American poets, and one of them, Chilean poet named Pablo Neruda, who wrote hundreds of praise poems. Have you read some of them? To things like tomatoes and socks. And the other is Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet who wrote a lot about ancient Mexican culture. And then a very gorgeous, recent Mexican poet, Pura Lopez Colon. They come up in this thing. Pertinent Divagations Toward an Ode to Inuit Carvers. Because it resembles a sphere, meaning a figure on which every point of its surface is equally distant from its center, but is a physical object, not a sphere, because as a practical matter, an actual physical object cannot be constructed, which has a surface, every point of which is perfectly equidistant from its center. Pablo Neruda may have missed an opportunity in failing to address an ode to the softball. Asexual moon of summer nights, the something to hit that initiates an intricate ballet of chance and rule-governed behavior on summer afternoons. And for that matter, he missed the soccer ball known in the civilized world as the football, which may have been, as a thought, more culturally available. And Octavio Paz, why did you keep your silence on the almost perfectly round stones that are still found to be lying around the ball courts of an Aztec ruins? Hot day, the tar and vanilla scent of dry summer grasses, the blue-bellied lizards so still on the stone they seem to be listening to the roar of crowds from Montezuma's last weeks, diminishing in the distance like a train whistle. And Pura Lopez, you were wrong to propose in the journalist bar in Mexico City after everyone had had lunch and a couple of caballitos, meaning little horses, meaning shots of tequila served in tiny ceramic cups, the blue color of melancholy when it's just turned the corner and got hold on itself. You were wrong in saying that women only like to watch baseball in television and in ballparks because the uniforms made men's butts pleasant objects of contemplation. Even the women at our table were outraged by this suggestion, and it's no wonder writers don't get much work done after 3 o'clock in Mexico City. And that night, when the weather had cooled, Pura, her crinkly black hair cut boyishly, the shiny and almost perfectly round brown irises of her eyes lifted to heaven, singing the soprano part in a Palestrina motet in an almost intimate Baroque church in Cuernavaca, not a trace of irony in her gammon's or angel gammon's face. This could be the preface to an ode circumambulating the softball, or the polyphonies of Palestrina. Almost perfect is the theme. If Plato could have had his way, if the earth were a sphere instead of almost a sphere, there would probably not be a wobble in its rotation, and hence no ice ages. And how would we have gotten through interminable afternoons in the 4th grade if there were no pictures of woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers as objects of contemplation in geography books? And while we are on the subject, have you ever noticed any pictures of Ice Age dinosaurs? That there's a profoundly tropical normative representation of this earthly domain in all the textbooks? Ice Age reptiles. We have wandered far from our subject, have we not? Or not? Think of the whiteness of the softball. Imagine a world in which dental and medical care for children was so completely available that all adults in both hemispheres had at least into their 20s and 30s almost perfectly white teeth. It implies, doesn't it, a completely different distribution of wealth? That's my point. We are governed by Ice Age reptiles. What if the cycle of oil wars were over and the undistribution of automatic weapons had commenced and the wars of distributive vengeance withered away and the insurrections against grasping dictatorial power rendered irrelevant? Everyone could be playing or watching softball. It's only a pop-up. An almost perfectly white day moon of an almost perfectly spherical softball looping through the blue summer air as if it were some sublimely graceful ice age sea creature riding the ocean of the air, and she's underneath it looking up, almost as if she were singing a Palestrina motet, the one in which the angel tells the young woman she is full of grace. The whole spectatorial world has assembled, leaning forward, sipping beer or not, sipping as yet to be invented ginger and anise-flavored beverage concoctions that our endlessly inventive kind has not yet devised, but with pleasant and familiar fizziness imparted to the nostrils. No one knows yet whether she will catch the ball or not. She doesn't know, but this is a poem in praise of imperfection, so maybe it doesn't matter. Freedom from fear, freedom from violence, and smiles the almost perfect white of the new tusks of an unmolested walrus pup. This is a poem to old Inuits and the tools they fashioned to fashion dolphins leaping from the lovely pale umber, formerly white, of old ivory. And next, three old men. It's in parts. One, midnight to bed. Something will come to you in the morning. It will be a Monday in summer, a beginning. There'll be misty sun in the morning, wind in the trees. Monday is a subject. Visit it in the morning. Two, Saint Monday, the old gardener in Shelford called it Mr. Acker. Why Saint Monday, I had asked. Because it takes care of you, doesn't it? If you've had a bid on Sunday, you get off to a nice slow start. That voice coming to me across 40 years. My daughter, who became a scholar of memory, used to like to talk to him about the names of plants. Sheep's parsley, he'd say, grows like billio. I've been hoeing it all my life, and now they want me to grow it. They think it looks rural. And I remember the old poet's voice when I was 40 or so and in agony. He must have been 70. He it was who shrugged and said, you can't kill delight in the people you love or in yourself. So you are hurt and you hurt others. Pause, looked amused. And of course, the more you've loved and been loved, the worse you're apt to hurt or be hurt. You know the expression, in for a penny, in for a pound? Found that scrap in my notebooks and thought to make a Monday poem from it. Moon's Day. He was a poet of the grandeur of wounds. My mother's breast was thorny, and father I had none, he had written, and the night nailed like an orange to my brow. He lived to be 100, and visiting him the day after his birthday, I said, Stanley, you're 100. And he said, I don't recommend it. Who had watched his wife die raving with dementia in the hospital room they had made from the dining room where he had served us, eyes wide with self-delight, his own bouillabaisse from a steaming tureen on a festive fall night 30 years before. 4. People do not stroll in Manhattan in January. Coming out of Stanley's, I looked at the bodies on Fifth Avenue bundled against the cold, leaning into the wind, going about their furious purposes, and I found myself making an inventory of pain I'd caused and seen caused in the name of something like delight. I knew the word for him was William Blake's word and had to do with some pact he'd made with himself as a young man to live and to have lived his wife, and I didn't get to ask him what the old man would say to the young man now. My daughter, at my grandson's graduation, We were standing in a garden in the muggy Midwestern heat of a late afternoon in June, drinking a cocktail called Dark and Stormy and studying the handsome young celebrants hugging each other. They'd been out drinking and carousing the night before, so this Saturday was a sort of Saint Monday. And my daughter said, "Pop, you remember the old gardener in the village in England? What was his name?" And I smiled and said, "Mr. Acker." And she smiled and said, "Yes, that's right, Mr. Acker." Every day a moon, every day a match struck and flaring. Talent is one thing, Stanley said when I was 30 or so, as if he thought I might be getting a little high from having a first book published. You need character for the long haul. Nobody wants you to be a poet. Died at almost 101. My mother's breast was thorny. He had made his life ashes in the garden he made of the salt air on the Cape. It's Tuesday's child must work for a living. Tears Day, God of war, God of one-handed combat, full of grace or not. Tomorrow, I'm going to hike to the waterfall and listen to the sound of it. One of the themes that came up this week was the history of weapons. So here's my go at this subject. The poem is called Dancing. The radio clicks on, it's poor, swollen. One of the things I've discovered, obvious for years, about reading, the difference between reading poems in books and reading poems, hearing poems read, is that in books you know how long they are. So you have some idea whether this is interminable or not. So this is maybe 3 pages. I'll raise my hand at the end of each page, and you'll know what's happening. Dancing. The radio clicks on. It's poor, swollen America up already and busy selling the exhausting obligation of happiness, while intermittently debating whether or not a man who kills 50 people in 5 minutes with an automatic weapon he has bought for the purpose is mentally ill, or a terrorist, or if terrorists are mentally ill. Because if killing large numbers of people with sophisticated weapons is a sign of sickness, you might want to begin with fire. Our earliest ancestors drawn to the warmth of it, from lightning must have been, the great booming flashes of it from the sky, the tree shriveled and sizzling must have been an awful power, the odor of ozone, a god's breath, or grass fires, the wind whipping them, the animals stampeding, furious, driving hard on their haunches from the terror of it, so that to fashion some campfire of burning wood, old logs must have felt like feeding on the crumbs of the god's power, and they would tell the story of Prometheus the thief and the eagle that feasted on his liver, told it around a campfire must have been, and then centuries, millennia, some tribe of meticulous gatherers, some medicine woman or craftsman of metal discovered some sands that tossed into the fire burned blue or flared green, so simple the children could do it, must have been, or some soft stone rubbed to a powder that tossed into the fire gave off a white phosphorescent glow. The word for chemistry from Greek, some say Arabic stem associated with metalwork, but it was in China 2,000 years ago that fireworks were invented, fire and mineral in a confined space to produce power. They knew already that the power of fire and water, about the power of fire and water and the power of steam. 100 BC, Julius Caesar's day. In Alexandria, a Greek mathematician produced a steam-powered turbine engine, contain, explode. The earliest depiction of a gunpowder weapon is the illustration of a fire lance on a mid-12th century silk banner from Don Juan, Silk and the Silk Road. First Arab guns in the early 14th century. The English used cannons and a siege gun at Calais in 1346, Serignan 1503, the first battle won by the power of rifles, when Spanish arquebusters cut down Swiss pikemen and French cavalry in a battle in southern Italy. Explosions of blood and smoke, lead balls tearing open the flesh of horses and young men, peasants, mostly farm boys, recruited to the armies of their feudal overlords. How did guns come to North America? 2014, a headline, divers discover the Santa Maria. One of the ship's Lombard cannons may have been stolen last year by salvage pirates off the Haitian reef where it had sunk. And Cortez took Mexico with 600 men, 17 horses, 12 cannons. And La Salle, 1679, constructed a 7-cannon bark, Le Griffon, and fired his cannon upon his first entry to the continent's interior, the sky darkened by the terror of the birds. In the dream time, they are still rising, swarming, darkening the sky, the chorus of their cries sharpening as the echo of that first astounding explosion shimmers on the water, the crew blinking at the wind of the bird's wings. Spring Arsenal, 1777. Rock Island Arsenal, 1862, the original Henry rifle, a 16-shot, 44 caliber, rimfire, lever action, breech-loading rifle patented, it was an age of tinkerers, by one Benjamin Henry Taylor in 1860, just in time for the Civil War. Confederate casualties in battle, about 95,000. Union casualties in battle, about 110,000. Contain, explode. They were throwing sand into the fire, a blue flare, an incandescent flame. The Maxim machine gun, 1914, 400 to 600 small caliber rounds per minute. The deaths in combat, all sides, 1914 to 1918, were 8,042,189. Someone was counting. Must have been. They could send things whistling into the air by boiling water. The children around the fire must have shrieked with delight. 1920, Iraq. The people of that place were restive under British rule, and the young Winston Churchill invented the new policy of aerial policing, which amounted, sources say, to bombing civilians and then pacifying them with ground troops, which led to the tactic of terrorizing civilian populations in World War II. Total casualties in that war worldwide, soldiers 21 million, civilians 27 million. They were throwing sand into the fire. The ancestor who stole lightning from the sky had his guts eaten by an eagle, spread-eagled on a rock, the great bird feasting. They are wondering if he is a terrorist or mentally ill. London, Dresden, Berlin, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The casualties difficult to estimate. Hiroshima, 66,000 dead. In a minute, Nagasaki, 39,000 dead. There were more people killed, 100,000 in more terrifying fashion in the firebombing of Tokyo. 2 arms races after the ashes settled. The other industrial countries couldn't wait to get there. Contain, burn. One scramble was for the rocket that delivers the explosion that burns humans by the tens of thousands and poisons the earth in the process. They were wondering if the terrorist was crazy, if he was a terrorist. Maybe he was just unhappy. The other challenge afterwards was how to construct machine guns a man or a boy could carry, lightweight, compact, easy to assemble. First, a Russian sergeant, a Kalashnikov, clever with guns, built one on a German model. Now the heavy machine gun, the weapon of European imperialism, through which we're almost at the end, which a few men trained in gunnery could slaughter native armies in Africa and India and the mountains of Afghanistan. It became a portable weapon a child can operate, the equalizer. So the undermanned Vietnamese insurgents fought off the greatest army in the world. So the Afghans fought off the Soviet army using Kalashnikovs the CIA provided to them. They were throwing powder in the fire and dancing. Children's armies in Africa toting AK-47s that fire 30 rounds a minute. A round is a bullet. An estimated 500 million firearms on the earth, 100 million of them are Kalashnikov-style semi-automatics. They were dancing in Orlando in a club, spring night, gay pride, the relation of the total casualties in the history of the weapon that sent exploded metals into their bodies, 30 rounds a minute or 40, is a beautifully made instrument. In America, you can buy it anywhere. They fired it into the history of the shaming culture that produced the idea of gay pride. They were mostly young men. They were dancing in a club, a spring night. The radio clicks on, green fire, blue fire, the immense flocks of terrified birds still rising in wave after wave above the waters in the dream time, crying out sharply as the French ship breasted the vast interior of the new land. America, the radio clicks on. The Arabs, the commentator is saying, require a heavy hand. They were dancing. So, what's another kind of poem and another tone of poem? I have a neighbor in a university town where I live in the hills, a Polish poet who, as a young man, early in the century, spent time in Paris and then in Germany, in Poland, during the Nazi occupation in those years. And for many years, he was in exile and he couldn't have his poems published in his own country. So we spent time putting his poems into English. And so he was writing poems about the sun going down over San Francisco Bay that nobody could read until they got published. And then he won the Nobel Prize for Literature when he was an older man. And then we worked on his poems some more. So this is an argument about poetics. Imagined at Squaw Valley after a night walk under the mountain. Did I read this here before? Did I? No. So again, I'll raise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. Raise my hand. My friend Czesław Miłosz disapproved of surrealism. Not hard to construct in imagination the reasons why. Late night and late winter in Warsaw. 2 friends are stopped by the police of the general government. They speak atrocious Polish, and they are stopped, the young men, because of their leather jackets. What would 2 Poles be doing wearing new brown leather jackets in the winter of 1943? Either they were black marketeers, the cops reasoned, or special enough to be left alone. The older policeman who had been a cop in Berlin in the quiet precincts of Charlottenburg, where he had learned to go along and get along, and who wanted now only to do his job well enough to avoid being sent to the Russian front, where he'd either be blown up or lose his toes to frostbite, wants nothing of this arrest. He's the one who lets the poet slip away. The other, younger, a machinist in Cologne before the war, is more ambitious. He asks the second man what he does, which for the Pole is a quandary. Does he say he is a philosopher, which is what he thinks of as his profession, or a teamster, which is how he makes his living now to avoid collaborating with the Germans? And secondly, should he answer him in Polish or in his reasonably correct German? He's completing after work in his drafty garret room a treatise on the Apollonian Dionysiac personalities described by Friedrich Nietzsche from a partly Marxist, partly Kabbalistic point of view. He feels instinctively the danger lies in claiming a superior social status, and so he says in Polish that he is a teamster, and the cop thinks, aha, black market, and takes him in. He's interrogated, turned over to the SS, beaten, interrogated some more, identified as a communist and an intellectual, and sent east to Auschwitz, where he eventually dies, shot, some of the stories say, wasted by typhus and diarrhea, say the others. The poet hears one of these versions of the news on the same spring day that he is contemplating a large, polished porcelain giraffe bobbing up and down to the strains of the Vienna waltz on a holiday carousel while gunfire crackles on the other side of the ghetto wall. Warsaw had been a Russian garrison town for a century. Now it's a German garrison town, and the pretty Polish girl in the giraffe is licking a pink cloud of cotton candy and flirting with the German officer on the zebra, which is also bobbing up and down. And the sheen on his high black boots, the poet notices involuntarily, has picked up the reflection of the sun in the small pools of spring rain on the warped tarmac apron of the carousel. After that, he doesn't want to read about French poets walking lobsters on a leash. And he doesn't want to seem to celebrate the fact that the world makes no sense. This is how, anyway, I imagine the state of mind produced by the fragments of the stories he would tell me. And here, inference and anecdote give way to argument. I would quote André Breton to him in the English translation. My wife with the armpits of metal trap and St. John's Eve. And he would say, or anyhow now in my imagination, he would say, well, yes, of course, I assent to armpits and metaphors at which Breton excelled, just as Modigliani excelled at armpits. Who does not love metaphor? It's quickness that gives us the world to taste with our common senses. I'll tell you what terrifies me. It is the idea that this is like that, is like this, is like that, is all of the story, endlessly repeated. The poor human imagination having evolved this brilliant swiftness of perception and then been stuck there like a hamster in a cage, groping in the endless turnstiles of resemblance. We are to celebrate this as a final conquest of absurdity by absurdity. The armpits of those women in Modigliani, on the contrary, are the hollows of their arms, like this perhaps or like that, but finally this woman exposing to us this tender nest or dark sweetness of a wet duck's feather tuft of hair in a gesture, notice, that lifts the breast slightly, indolently, and lifts the rosy nipple and offers it to us, one of the gifts. Also sunrise, the scent of linen, of the air before first snow, that the world has given to poor mortals among the terrors and confusions of being what we are. Well, I might have said, if you permit me to get technical, Modigliani is making a generalized representation of the idea of a particular woman. Exactly, a particular being. General because being this and not that, this not like that, this one mortal thing is what mortality has given us in common. And this is the Milosian religion? Yes, he laughs. In my religion, if we are going to starve, we will starve on the pears of Cézanne and the apples of Chardin. He squints a little. In my religion, metaphor makes us ache because things are and are what they are and perish. Let us not neglect to consider the slow withering of the pale skin of that girl and her nest of lymph nodes and the pheromones of love and fear. And we mustn't fail to mention lymphatic cancers, nature's brutally stupid way of clearing the earth for organism freed temporarily from withering and disease, and the misfiring of the avidity to reproduce, which is a special trick of the cells we are made of in some chemical slime. And on the subject of armpits, let us not neglect the distinctive smell of fear, which reminds us that in Mr. Darwin's horrific scheme, we are to find beautiful the fact that among the higher mammals, the sauce that gives spice to their meat is the adrenaline of pure terror. Or worse, the adrenaline of the chase, exhilaration, and then terror. And for all we know, of despair, it may have a taste in the prey they are devouring. Nature is, after all, chemistry, and chemistry is this becomes that, becomes this, becomes that, endlessly through endless witherings, endless contortions of mammal and reptile and insect suffering and fear. What does it know of her armpit? That breast, those lips turned to the mirror for glistening and reddening, and the way she, a girl who did not feel pretty as a girl, examines her plucked, arched, perfectly elegant eyebrow and pats lightly the slick set of her hair, a 1910s set, that decade's no other of her thick auburn hair. Sounds like you know who she was, I said. Well, he said, there were two women. Jeanne Hébuterne, who killed herself, threw herself out the window. She was pregnant with his child the year after he died. She was French. Our odalisque of the raised arm was Lunia Tchaikovsky, Modigliani's dealer. Lunia Tchaikovsky, Modigliani's dealer. Zobarovsky was a poet, minor one, and he introduced Lunia to the painter. Zobarovsky was a friend of my uncle, but he died the year I arrived in Paris that first time, so I never met him. But I did meet Tchaikovsky. You met Tchaikovsky? She had me to tea. I was 21. She must have been about 40, thick in the waist, looked it was winter. She wore tweed. She tested me by conducting our interview, mostly about my uncle's poetry and Zobarovsky's, entirely in French. I remember thinking that her hands looked old, early arthritis perhaps, and was somehow beautiful, nevertheless, something delicate in the way she served the little Noel cakes and the tea, which I devoured. I was living on my student stipend and then felt humiliated that I'd cleaned the plate before she touched it. He laughed. And I remember her scent, amaryllis. The apartment near the bookstore on Rue de Poutrin smelled of the ginger in the cakes and black tea, and her scent of amaryllis like dry summer grass. Česlov was buried in a crypt in the Krakowian church of St. Peter of the Rock, among other Polish notables. I hated the idea of it and still do, that his particular body is lying there in a cellar of cold marble and old bones under the weight of 2,000 years of the Catholic Church. Thinking about this still years later, imagining this dialogue in the dark under the shadowy mass of a mountain and the glittering stars, not liking the fact that it is perhaps what he would have wanted. You should have been buried. Still talking to him. You should have been buried on a grassy hillside open to the sun. The Lithuanian sun, the peasants carved on crosses in the churchyard of your childhood. And what you called in one poem, the frail light of birches. You should have been buried under the frail light of birches. And he might have said no. He might have said, I choose marble in the Catholic Church because they say no to natural beauty that lures us and kills us. I say no until poor Modigliani and Zobarovsky and Tchaikovsky, the girl of the raised arms and breast, and the grown woman with her ginger cakes and already liver-spotted hands, and Jeanne Boutin and her unborn child have risen from the dead. And I say, there are other ways of thinking about this. You described headlights sweeping a field on a summer night. Do you remember that poem? I can quote it to you. You said you could sense the heartbeat of the living and the dead. It was a night in July, he said, in Pennsylvania. To me then, an almost inconceivably romantic name. And the air was humid and smelled of wet earth after rain. I remember the night very well. My lines, not so much. Czesław Miłosz. So for a change of pace, a poem that requires audience participation. So the first thing you have to do is say the title of this poem after me 3 times rapidly. The title is The Six Sheep's Sick. The six sheep sick. The six sheep's sick. The six sheep's sick. Praise to the breath and the lips and the teeth. Praise to the tongue and the larynx and the pharynx and the soft palate and the hard palate and the vibrations of the vocal cords. Peter Piper picked a peck of seashells by the seashore. Of seashells by the seashore. She sells rubber baby buggy bumpers. Sells rubber baby buggy bumpers. It's early March, late afternoon. There's one tiny tufted titmouse in the bare branches of the sycamore just outside my window. The smallest and the loudest of all the spring birds. its eye the size of a single black currant. 3 sweet notes, perfectly spaced, and then sometimes 4. Not difficult to say, one tiny tufted titmouse, one tiny tufted titmouse, but it requires a small increment of effort. And in the bare branches of the sycamore, is pure pleasure. When I read my poems aloud, I find it's hard to say that the people in my part of the world stand on tiptoe to pick ripe huckleberries that the deer can't reach. Pick ripe huckleberries that the deer can't reach. Ripe huckleberries. Aluminum linoleum. The round leaf buds on the tips of the branches of the sycamore are glowing gold in the afternoon sun. 3 sweet notes again. It wants a mate. Maybe it's just playing. Researchers have taught chimps over 100 words in the book say they can't use them to form new concepts. She sells pickled peppers. 3 notes again, but can't doesn't seem just right. What if it's just not in the range of things the chimps feel like doing? I want to say ripe huckleberries. Ripe. The titmouse flits from branch to branch. Because I want to. Praise to the breath and the teeth and the lips. Praise to the tongue and to the animal who first said pharynx and the one who first said larynx. Praise. So 2 more poems. One is, today is my wedding anniversary. And let me find the poem, which is called To Be Accompanied by Flute and Zither. We live on a coastal hill with a view west onto a bay, a mountain, a rust gold bridge, and the sea beyond them. There are several sleeping islands on the bay, dark with chaparral. And east of us, in summer gold hills of wild grasses, with a scattering of oaks on the hillsides, a green so dark they are almost blue, and with madrone and laurel in the canyons. And east of those trees, a wide valley, hot and flat, the remnant bed of torrential glacial rivers, once an immense lake, and then a bog, and then a meadow so thick with wildflowers in the late spring you could hear the bee hum before you crested the Coast Range hills to look down on it, colors so thick and variegated that they seemed to be breathing, O Elysium. And now, who was the other day saying poets never say "oh" in poems anymore? Here's my "oh." Breathing, O Elysium, and now a farm country, mostly industrial farming with the strong smell of onion fields in summer and river towns along the sloughs and an endless rosary of shopping malls built to collapse in a generation or so with parking lots full of empty cars and car windshields glittering in the midday heat. And east of the valley, the slow rise of red earth foothills, oakwood giving way to pine, and then a gradual climb 7,000 feet to the mountain massive of glacier-carved granite, mountain lakes blue-green with snow melt, and lodgepole pine, Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, incense cedar forests that smell of pine sap and pineapple and the scentlet high mountain air, and even in summer, snow patches in the saddles between peaks. And among the calls and turns of the mountain escarpment, there are immense lakes, turquoise blue to the depths, with emerald green on the deeper shores, and small lakes, ice blue in the afternoon when the sky clouds up, and small meadow valleys that must once have been lakes long ago, where small streams splash down a canyon, some small creek to water a meadow, a ski resort now, a bit lazy and full of tourists in shorts in the summer. But there pass out of that valley under the pines the loud jays of the mountains squawking, and scarlet gilia with their little trumpet flowers, and the dangling intricate red and gold flower of the columbine, and red also for the Indian paintbrush, because the mountain is kind to hummingbirds, which can see red as the bees can't, and the bees, the brilliant blue of the larkspur, and the fuzzy soiled white of pearly everlasting, and for everyone the bright yellow monkey flower that likes the spray of plunging water. It breathes well there. Breeze, my dear, and that may be you standing in the trail above it, that trail we first walked together under the sheared granite some 20 years ago, you among buckbrush and huckleberry oak with a field guide in hand naming the lichens. Have you noticed that this is an anniversary poem, a medicine bundle for the hard stretches when we carry what we've glimpsed into the grinding days down the hill, which we'll be walking, muscles a little sore as the breeze comes up and gives a lightness to the summer air. I said one more poem, but I'll read another short one because of the birding thing here. We saw a hooded warbler, which is a brilliant little bird that never comes to the West Coast. I saw it incredibly vividly, but for half a second, and got a longer look at the astonishing indigo bunting. This is called Mouth Slightly Open. The body, a yellow brilliance, and a head some orange color from a Chinese painting dipped in sunset by the summer gods, who are also producing that twitchy shiver in the cottonwoods, less wind than river, where the bird you thought you saw was, or whether you believe what you thought you saw or not, and then was not, had absconded, leaving behind the emptiness that hums a little in you now and is not bad or sad and only just resembles awe or fear. The bird is elsewhere now, and you are here. Okay, one more poem. It's here. I know where it is. And it's called A Talk at Sewanee. Ellen Douglas, who is dead now, she must have been 80 that year and would live for another decade, though she never wrote another novel and had just published a book called Truth, 4 Stories I Am Finally Old Enough to Tell. Though she was wearing a pair of jeans, got away, some of the young women remarked later, with wearing a pair of jeans and a shirt of light peach-colored linen in the July heat, by which they meant, I think, that it was not some undignified gesture toward girlishness by an older woman. She wore what she wore well, and center stage, arms crossed, seated on a stool in front of a room full of reverent young writers, wore an expression on her face that seemed to me, consulting an old journal, both baffled by the way they leaned forward and completely self-assured when she regarded them. It was a face to which you still wanted to attach the word pretty, not feminine, but womanly or adult and female, and the shimmer of chestnut in her gray hair was pleasant to look at. Style, she was saying, is really just seeing. It's the way they talk about a way of seeing. If you want to write, read. And if you read good books well, it will wake in you a desire to say what you mean. At least it did in me. The things that you read that matter to you, the things they call your influences, are the books that introduce you to yourself. And they will lead, or ought to a patient, persistent attempt to say what you mean. Another of my notes reads, you have to write blindly to eventually see clearly what your subject is. A close, humid room in the middle of Tennessee in the middle of July. Outside, you could not tell if the green hum in the old live oaks was generating the insect buzz, or the buzz was generating the green humming in the air that was indistinguishable when you walked in it from the soaked odor of the summer grass. I was an outsider to what I took to be a transaction in heritage. Her authority, I knew, derived from the 10 or so novels and books of stories she'd written over the course of 30 years. She had written about whiteness in Mississippi from the point of view of what race and gender relation did to the lives of women inside families. And she must have got it right, or some of it right. I'd read a few of the books. I thought I could tell from the palpable silence and the leaning forward bodies of the young writers in that otherwise uncomfortable room. The air conditioning wasn't working, and they were fanning themselves with their manuscripts and conference schedules like spectators fanning in southern courtrooms in the movies. I'd been thinking that day of my cousin Lisa's death from an overdose of drugs, thinking it's brutal the way some lives work and some don't. She was 29. She'd acquired a taste for heroin at 16 from her 19-year-old boyfriend, who was the son of a record company producer in LA. They went to the same private school. Same private school. Lisa was my playmate summers in the early years of our childhoods, the runt of her litter. 3 older brothers. She was part pest, part love kid sister, a risk taker to keep up with and provoke her brothers. At 16, I remember that both she and her boyfriend wore black leather jackets and that she had pinned to hers the dried up body of a large flattened toad she found in the street and apparently identified with. She'd married, had a child, been in and out of expensive treatment programs that her older brother, who we called Skipper, had also been in and out of because he had a drinking problem that he must have got sick of because he jumped the year before Lisa died from a highway overpass into the middle of the commute traffic in Pasadena. I called my aunt, who would have been about Ellen Douglas's age. She said, "You know, I have no tears. Isn't it awful? I seem to be out of tears." Ellen Douglas is a pen name, born in the 1920s into a world in which respectability could have impressed her into collusion with the degrading system of apartheid. I don't know what saves people. I know we tend to love our children. I know addiction wrecks lives. It feels like a mystery. Whatever idea of the good had set that handsome old woman in front of an audience of young writers, shaking her head and saying, "You have to write your way to knowing what you have to say. And then with no guarantees, you have to keep trying to write your way in the general direction of what it would feel like to actually say it." So thank you very much.